Okay, welcome to lesson 10. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about quoting effectively. So in this lesson, we have 4 objectives. One is to understand what quoting is. So what does it mean to quote and why it's helpful to quote? To understand how to select quotes effectively. How do you choose good quotes? And how many quotes should you choose? To understand how to integrate quotes effectively into your writing. So how do you bring quotes into your writing well? So after this lesson, I want you to read Graph. It's chapter 3, and it's called The Art of Quoting. So this is a really nice chapter too. Like I said, The Art of Summarizing is one of the best chapters in the book, but The Art of Quoting isn't far behind. He has some really good tips for quoting in here. So that's on pages 42 through 50. So make sure you read that right after this lesson. It's a really nice companion to this lesson. Also, make sure you read Hacker APA 2 and Hacker APA 3. And in these sections, she also talks about some of the tools of quoting and how to integrate your quotes well. Some of what Graph talks about and Hacker talks about is similar to what I talk about. I think all 3 of us are sort of in dialogue with some of the same points, but each of us has some slightly different things that we bring to it. So read these 2 afterwards, and I think you'll have a good sort of picture of how to quote effectively. Let's start off with a quick review. In lesson 9, I discussed effective summarizing, what you do to summarize effectively. And following lesson 9, I had you read 2 articles. One was by David Zinchenko and one was by Bradley Balco, and they were both about whether or not the government should control what we eat. And I really like this graphic right here of Uncle Sam holding the apple. They're interesting. As David Zinchenko thinks that fast food companies need to be held responsible. Balco thinks that the government shouldn't get in the way of what it is that we're trying to eat. So I wanted you to summarize both of those based on the strategies that we use, and I gave you some feedback on that. So as I discussed, it's really important in academic writing to be able to put others' ideas into your own words. That's probably one of the most important tools, right, is being able to restate in your own words what is an author's idea. However, sometimes it's more helpful to show an author's ideas in his or her actual words. In these cases, you want to quote directly. So direct quotation is when you bring an author's exact language into your own writing without putting it into your own words. And whenever you bring an author's exact language in, you want to make sure you put these quotation marks around here. Right, so anything that's not your language, you want to make sure you put the quotation marks around so the reader knows this isn't your wording, this isn't your phrasing. You didn't create these sentences. You took them directly from a source. So there's many reasons why you might want to use a direct quotation. So one reason you might want to use a direct quotation is because they can be really helpful in your summaries and responses to support your rephrasing of an author's ideas. So as you're summarizing, when you bring those quotes in, it kind of reemphasizes that your summary is correct, and it sort of brings that author's language in so that the reader can sort of hear and see a little bit of the original while still getting your summary. Also, you might want to quote if an author says something perfectly. So sometimes an author just spends a lot of time getting a phrasing of a thesis or something exactly correct, and it's really hard to reword it better than that. And if that happens, you just want to bring that in because it's perfect as it is. You might as well quote it directly. Finally, it can be really helpful to quote when you have a complicated passage and an author words something very precisely, especially a sentence that has a lot of statistics in it. It can be really hard to try to redo that in any way. You're better off just kind of quoting those things directly. So there's some of the reasons why you want to quote, right? But you also want to be careful about how you select quotes, because not all things make good quotes. Some things do make good quotes, some things do not make good quotes. Things that make good quotes as a general rule are theses, right? So if you come across a thesis statement anywhere in a piece, that might be a good thing to quote. Or maybe some main ideas in the piece, or topic sentences of paragraphs, since these things usually represent larger, broader points that an author is trying to make. They usually make really good quotes. So be on the lookout for those, because those could be nice things to quote. A thesis. Also, sentences that reach conclusions can be helpful for the same reason. So it could be the conclusion of an essay, but sometimes at the end of a long paragraph, a reader will have a sentence or two that kind of encapsulates or summarizes or captures the entire point of the paragraph. Those could be good things to quote as well for the same reason as thesis and main ideas, because they represent broader points that the author is trying to make. Also, like I mentioned a little bit ago, if you have some sentences that have lots of statistics or numerical data, those can be really hard to recast, so you might want to quote those ones directly. Finally, if an author gives a really short, sort of pithy, careful example, that could be a nice one to quote as well, rather than trying to put it into your own words. So there's a couple of the things you might want to quote. Now let's talk about integrating quotes effectively into your writing. So once you've selected good quotes, you want to bring them in well and smoothly so that the reader understands the quotes and can see their role in your essay. So good integration starts with limiting the number and size of your quotes. You don't want too many quotes. That's a general rule, and you don't want your quotes to be too big. As a general rule, shorter quotes are usually more manageable, like a sentence or less. I have to find that when a quote gets to be longer than a sentence or two, when you bring it into the essay, it's really hard to handle that entire quote afterwards, or because the quote might cover several different points. So usually shorter quotes are much better. I usually tell people a sentence or less. And there's no general rule, but a lot of people want to know, how many quotes should I put into my essay? And, this is a guideline that you could go by. I would say no more than 3 sentence length quotes per page is a pretty good sort of rule of thumb. Also, there are times where you might want to bring longer quotes into your essay, quotes that are longer than 40 words, which could be multiple sentences. They definitely have a place. So for instance, if we were citing a definition, like a really technical legal definition, it's probably going to be, several sentences. And you might want to bring that directly in because it's much better to actually quote the legal law or legal definition than to try to put it into your own words. But that would be considered a long quote, which you format slightly differently, which we'll talk about in a second. And you wouldn't want more than probably 1 long quote for every 5 pages of writing. So if you're doing a 5-page essay, you might have 1. If you're doing a longer research paper, you might have 2 or 3. You don't want too many long quotes, though. So after you carefully select and limit your quotes, you also want to frame your quotes carefully in your writing, or bring them into your writing carefully. And I always tell people a nice way to bring quotes into your writing is to use this ICE method. Here's my graphic. Be like Elsa. Obviously, I have 2 young kids, so I'm really familiar with Elsa and her magical powers. Be like her, the Ice Queen. Ice your quotes. Here she is, integrating a quote. So when you ice your quotes, you introduce them. So you tell the reader what they're going to see. You cite, or you put the quote down, and then you explain afterwards. What did we see in that quote, and what did that quote mean? What's the value of the quote? So we're going to talk about each of these 3 a little bit more in the next slides. So whenever you bring quotes into your essay, you want to introduce them carefully. That is, prepare the reader for the quote. So in the signal phrase, right, that leads up to the quote, you want to make sure you mention the author's last name. So according to Smith, and in APA style, you always mention the year as well. So according to Smith, 2005, and then you can give your direct quote. In introducing, it's always a good idea to give context too. So you wouldn't just want to say, according to Smith 2005, quote. You want to tell the reader, what are we going to see in the quote? So here's an example of a signal phrase introducing a quote with a little bit of context. And this was from our discussion on academic writing. Remember, we read that piece on Kenneth Burke's Parlor. So if we're going to quote the Parlor section, we would say, Kenneth Burke, 1890, compares academic writing to a lively parlor discussion in his famous excerpt. He writes, and then you give the quote. So here we mention who the author is, and we mention the year. And we give a brief overview of what we're going to see in the quote. He compares academic writing to a lively parlor discussion of his famous excerpt. He writes, and then we would go on to quote that excerpt directly. So there's a good way to give a little bit of context for your quotes before them as a way of introducing them. When a writer does not give a good context to the quote, but just sort of inserts the quote in with no introduction, it's called hit and run quote. Or that's what Graf calls it, a hit and run quote, and I like that. Basically, you just sort of drop the quote in and then, drive away. Hacker calls it a dropped quote, just sort of throwing a quote in with no introduction. Whatever you call it, hit and run or dropped quote, you want to be careful not to do this. Always introduce your quotes carefully. So let's take a look at a dropped quote, and this is, or a hit and run quote, and this is actually the example from Graf, and I think it's a pretty good example, so I brought it in here in its entirety. So here's an original example of a hit and run or dropped quote, and as I read this, pay attention to how confusing the quote is. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the island had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs in the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls surveyed reported dieting, 149 through 50. I think Bordeaux is right. Another point Bordeaux makes is, do you think Bordeaux is right? Do you even know what this is about? Maybe if we read it again, you'd understand. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. What do eating disorders have to do with dieting? In 1998, 3 years after programs in the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls reported dieting. Okay, I'm really confused by this quote. And the reason this quote is so confusing is because it's kind of a complicated quote. It's talking about a study that was done in Fiji, and it was about eating disorders and how in 1998, after the United States and Britain began broadcasting, 62% of girls reported dieting. So it seems like it has to do with the broadcasting of programs and how that affects people's need to diet. But that's not at all what the introduction talks about. This is really vague. Susan Bordeaux writes about women in dieting. She didn't mention that we're going to see a research study. She didn't mention the focus of the research study, which actually has to do with programming and the need to diet. So we don't have a whole lot here. Plus, she doesn't explain anything here. She just sort of, moves right on into her opinion. So here's a good example of a hit and run quote. It's definitely has no context. Very confusing. A reader would have to read this maybe 4 or 5 times before understanding it. But here's an example of the exact same quote, except this one has a lot more context, and we can see it's a bit more robust too, so it ended up being a bit longer. So given good context and explaining effectively can also help you to develop and expand your writing. But here's an example of a well-integrated quote. The feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux deplores the hold that Western obsession with dieting has on women. Okay, so it's about the obsession with dieting. Her basic argument is that increasing numbers of women across the globe are being taught to see themselves as fat and in need of a diet. Citing the islands of Fiji as case in point, Bordeaux notes that until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls surveyed reported dieting. Bordeaux's point is that the West's obsession with dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. Ultimately, Bordeaux complains the culture of dieting will find you regardless of where you live. So this is much more effective. We don't get lost at all in here because she spends several sentences giving us the context. She tells us Bordeaux's idea. She's against the West's obsession with dieting and how the spreading of Western influences to remote places is causing dieting in those places. And she cites, and the author here mentions that Bordeaux cites Fiji as a case in point. This is all before we get the quote, so that when we get this complicated quote, we have an idea for what we're going to see in there. And then after the quote, she does a really nice job explaining it. Look at how she just basically rewords what Bordeaux says. Bordeaux's point is that the West's obsession with dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. So here she's kind of summarizing or encapsulating the entire point of the quote here. Ultimately, Bordeaux complains the culture of dieting will find you regardless of where you live. So there's a much better example of a well-integrated quote. So that's why you want to make sure you integrate your quotes well. But there's also a couple other considerations that you should have while you're introducing quotes. So here's some technicalities of introducing quotes. So when you introduce a quote with a complete sentence, we talked about sentences before, so when you introduce with a complete sentence, you use a full colon. And when you introduce a quote with a partial sentence, you use a comma. So let's take a look at a couple other examples of that. So here's an example of introducing a quote with a complete idea and using a colon. In the woods where I lived and what I lived for, Thoreau, 1920, so that's the title of the article, 1920, states directly his purpose for going into the woods. Full colon, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front out the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So here, kind of a complicated quote, but the idea here is he introduces the quote with a full sentence. Thoreau states directly his purpose for going into the woods, and then full colon, and then we have this. Here's another one. Thoreau, 1920, ends his essay with a metaphor. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. And so here's an example of the full sentence introduction, and we have a colon here. She also mentions the author and the year, and she uses the quotation marks, and she has in APA style P period the page number here. Down. So here's an example of a short idea to introduce a quote. So this is when you don't have a complete sentence to introduce your quote. Thoreau, 1920, asks, comma, why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? And then here's the page number. So this is a good example of introducing with a short phrase. Use the comma. Here's another one. According to Thoreau, 1920, comma, we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. Page 27. So there's another example. So whenever you introduce with a phrase or a short part of a sentence, use a comma. If you introduce with a complete sentence, use a quote. So let's move on. After you introduce your quotes, you want to cite, or basically insert your quote. So if the quote is short, which is under 40 words, like some of the examples we've been seeing, you just put quotation marks around the entire quote. If the quote's longer than 40 words, you want to use a block quotation, which we'll look at in just a second. So here are some tools for quoting. You can remove words from a quote by using an ellipsis, like for instance if a quote is kind of long and has some parts that you don't necessarily want to put in there, you can take those parts out and just use the 3 dots or the ellipses to show that you've taken some information out of the quote. In addition, if you want to add some information, like let's say a quote is in a different tense, verb tense, and you want to change from past tense, said, to says, you can do that. You just want to make sure you put a bracket around the whatever language you're inserting into the quote, so the reader knows that this wasn't in the original, you're adding it to the quote. Finally, make sure you use page numbers. So like the examples that we've been seeing, anytime you introduce a quote or a quote directly, you want to make sure you put page numbers in. So in APA style, you always just put P, period, and then the page number of the page with a period at the end. So make sure you use page numbers for all of your direct quotes. So let's go back and take a look at some of these tools, a couple of examples of some of these tools. So here's an example of the ellipses and the brackets, right? So I just said a second ago, in order to insert something, you can use a bracket. So here's an example. Dillard, 2008, was, quote, stunned into stillness as the weasel was emerging from beneath an enormous, shaggy wild rose bush 4 feet away. So here, the word weasel wasn't in there. Maybe it said, it, and she wanted to specify what it is because it wouldn't have made sense in the context of her essay, so she puts the weasel in. and uses brackets. And then notice here she uses the page number at the end. You do need the period, P period 21. And here's an example of using ellipses. So if you want to take something out of a quote, Diller 2008 says that the weasel bites his prey at the neck, ... and he does not let go, page 21. So there was more about what the weasel does to the prey, but the author of this quote didn't think it was, the author of this passage didn't think it was important, so she uses the ellipses to take it out, and he does not let go. So there's how you use ellipses and brackets to introduce. And all these that we've been looking at are good examples of short quotes. Right? So the short quote conventions, use the comma if you're just introducing with a phrase. Use a full colon if you're introducing with a complete thought. Make sure you put quotation marks around whatever you're quoting. Make sure you use page numbers. Use the bracket if you want to add words. Use the ellipses if you want to take words away. So let's take a look at an example of a long quote. So you don't want to use long quotes too often, but sometimes you need to, like if something's really precise, or like I said, if you have a long definition, you might want to quote that directly. So if you do use a long quote, here's how you do it. You want to make sure you introduce the quote using a full colon. So according to the Dr. Burkett 2009, and then you have a full colon here, here's the direct quote. Notice how there's no quotation marks. It's just indented. So for a long quote, you indented a full tab space. So in the context of a whole essay, most of the essay would be to the left, but the long quote would be indented the full tab space. It's still double spaced, but the indent tells the reader this is a direct quote. So you don't need to use the quotation marks, either before or after. So those are the big features of the long quote. So according to the Dr. Burkett 2009, chronic egg laying is a very common problem in cocktails, lovebirds, and budgies, and is seen in other species of pet birds, including macaws, cockatoos, Amazons, and African greys. This problem can begin in your bird as early as 9 months or as late as several years of age. The most common age range for is from 1 to 3 years, page 21. So that's a good example of a long quote directly from that passage. Let's flip back to the PowerPoint again. So after you cite, so you introduce your quote and then you cite, and you keep in mind these tools of quoting, it's also a good idea to explain. Right? So you always want to spend some time after your quotes. Don't just move on to a new thought, but spend some time sort of explaining what does that quote mean. And I think that Bordeaux example had a really good explanation after. So it's a good idea to explain your quotes or to rephrase them into your own words, especially if the quotes are complicated, because the reader might not fully understand the quote. It might need you to just tell them this is what they mean here. So it's really helpful to use some of the templates that Graph suggests. So you could say, what the author means here. So after a quote, you could say, what the author means here is this. What Bordeaux means in this quote is this. Or, in other words, what Bordeaux is getting at is this. So I think those are pretty good ways to introduce an explanation. And it's helpful to always explain after your quotes. So let's talk about putting everything together. So whenever you're writing academically, you should consider using quotes. I think quotes are helpful for all the reasons we talked about before, so that they help to reinforce your ideas, and sometimes they're necessary. They work really well in summaries, right? When you're restating an author's words, if you integrate quotes as part of that summary, it can help the summary to be a lot more effective. And let's take a look at one more example. So here's an example of a summary, and this is just like the summary you just wrote. Here's a summary of David Zinchenko's article, Don't Blame the Eater. So we'll take a look at it, and I think it's a pretty good summary of the article. She captures it well, completely and accurately, and also she integrates quotes pretty well in here too. So let's see how the quotes and the summary go together as part of this sample. So in David Zinchenko's 2006 article, Don't Blame the Eater, he introduces the topic of children taking on and challenging fast food industries for making them fat. So here, she has the author and title and main idea, just like we talked about when you're summarizing. But as part of the main idea, she quoted this phrase, making them fat, which was directly from Zinchenko. So she's doing it. You don't have to put page numbers if you have a quote that's this short. But when you're doing this, you're sort of combining the author's words with your words, and it makes it more authentic to the original. So the reader sort of sees it as more authentic. Although Zinchenko sympathizes with these children, he reminds us, isn't that like a middle-aged man suing Porsche for making them get speeding tickets? And so this is page 391. So she quoted this because she likes Zinchenko's comparison between middle-aged men suing Porsche for getting speeding tickets. And she probably thought that it was said perfectly and she didn't want to restate it, so she puts it in the direct quotes. Nice. Zinchenko explains that he sympathizes with these children because of his own childhood. With a single mom working all the time, meal options consisted of McDonald's, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, or Kentucky Fried Chicken. Luckily for him, Zinchenko went to college and became much more health conscious, but most teenagers on a fast food diet won't be so lucky. As Zinchenko 2006 put it, they've crossed under the golden arches to a likely fate of lifetime obesity. Page 392. So here's a really nice quote, and look at how she gives us good context. Says, luckily Zinchenko went to college, but for most teenagers they won't be so lucky. As Zinchenko puts it, they've crossed under the golden arches to a likely fate of lifetime obesity. So the quote is really about teenagers not being so lucky, and that's sort of what she introduces here. They won't be so lucky. So she doesn't really explain it, but I think in this case it's pretty self-explanatory, so you don't really need an explanation. In addition to this point, Zinchenko emphasizes the fact that type 2 diabetes, obesity-related, has dramatically risen since 1994, then only affecting about 5% of children with diabetes in the country. Today, the National Institutes of Health estimates that type 2 diabetes affects approximately 30% of children with diabetes. Specifically, Zinchenko points out that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention approximated that $2.6 billion were accounted for by diabetes, and today it has risen to a staggering $100 billion. However, Zinchenko commiserates with the fast food eaters, claiming that there are McDonald's and Taco Bells around every corner and nowhere to buy a grapefruit. So here, she's capturing the idea that there's not a lot of variety, and she actually quotes this short little phrase from Zinchenko, nowhere to buy a grapefruit, just to sort of emphasize the lack of variety and connect her writing with Zinchenko so we can hear his voice in here. In addition, Zinchenko points out that the majority of fast food packaging lacks calorie information charts, and if the packaging does list nutritional information, it can be very misleading. Adding to his claims, Zinchenko specifies that on an information chart for a specific company's chicken salad, a seemingly healthy alternative, it lists the calorie content for just the chicken and the greens, and separately lists the calories for the nuts, salad dressing, and noodles that also come into the salad. Even worse, the meal is actually 2.5 servings. So here, she's summarizing Zinchenko's point about the calorie information. She didn't use a quote in here. She may have used a quote to connect with that, but good summary there. Zinchenko concludes that it would benefit fast food industries to protect themselves from these lawsuits and provide accurate nutritional information so that people can protect themselves to make knowledgeable choices about their food. So that's it. So that's a pretty good example, I think, of a summary of this piece. It's very accurate and it's concise. So it's relatively short while also being complete. I think she definitely represents every single piece. In addition, she uses her quotes really well here to kind of connect what Zinchenko's words with her own words. So there's a good way of sort of combining your quotes with your summaries, and I think that's a good idea. As your summaries, use some summarizing, use some quotes for emphasis, just so the reader can see your point. So let's flip back. So when you do combine your quotes with your summaries, I think it makes your summaries a lot more effective and gives you a lot more authority as a writer. So let's just briefly wrap up this unit. So you want to make sure that you select your quotes carefully, right? So make sure you choose quotes that'll fit well in your essay. Also, make sure you integrate them effectively by using that ICE method, right? Be like Elsa. Use your magic ice power to integrate your quotes. So after this lesson, I want you to read Graph Chapter 3, The Art of Quoting. This goes along really well with what I've just been talking about. And also read Hacker APA 2 and APA 3 that also talks about integrating quotes. Between these three, I think you'll have a really good picture of how to quote well. So after reading those, move on to Lesson 11, which is really a companion for this lesson. In that one we talk about APA style, which I've sort of been talking about in here, but we're going to pick up on that and talk more about it specifically the next lesson, and I'll see you there.